Lu Yifei had never been a believer in fate. She always thought life was a series of random events strung together by the illusion of order. But that was before the morning everything around her unraveled, before she learned that reality, as she knew it, was just one of many versions of the same thing. That it all started like any other hungover morning. Her head was pounding, a dull throb that seemed to match the slow, sloshing beat of her stomach. She groaned as she opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh light of her bedroom. The ceiling above her was just as it had always been, a patchwork of uneven paint spots and cracks that looked like scars. The clock on her bedside table read 9:42 a.m. She had missed work. It wasn't the first time, but this time felt different. There was a weight in the air, a peculiar thickness, like something was wrong. Something in her bones itched, a nervous twitch that she couldn't quite explain. She rubbed her temples, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. Dragging herself out of bed, Lu stumbled toward the window, pulling aside the curtain to look outside. The city below was a typical mess of gray concrete, dirty streets, and endless traffic. The morning sky was muted, the sun struggling to peek through the haze. But something was off. She squinted. Wasn't there a coffee shop at the corner yesterday? She was sure of it. But when she looked down again, the street corner was empty, just another generic building with a sign she didn't recognize. Lu blinked, confused. Okay, maybe I'm still drunk, she muttered under her breath. She turned back to her apartment, needing something to ground her in reality. Her phone sat on the bedside table, screen cracked, but still functional. She grabbed it, swiping through the notifications. There was a message from her best friend, Wei, who usually sent her something ridiculous every morning to get her day started. But this time, the message was strange. Wei, are you okay? You've been gone for 2 days. 2 days, Lu stared at the screen, disbelief settling in. She was sure it had only been a few hours since they last spoke. She quickly shot a text back. Lu Yifei, what are you talking about? It's the 21st of April. I'm just hungover. Wei didn't respond right away, but Lu could see the little bubbles, the typical sign that her friend was typing. She waited. The minutes ticked by, but Wei didn't reply. A deep sense of unease spread across her chest, but she couldn't place the reason. She had never been the superstitious type. There was no such thing as a glitch in the matrix, no evil overlords manipulating her life. Or so she thought. Lu shook her head, deciding to shake off the paranoia. She walked out of her room, heading for the kitchen, hoping a cup of coffee would fix everything. But as she moved into the hall, the feeling only deepened. Something wasn't right. She turned the corner toward the kitchen and stopped dead in her tracks. There was a figure standing there, barely visible, shrouded in a strange blue glow. At first, it appeared to be a trick of her half-awake eyes, some weird reflection in the window, but as the figure slowly turned toward her, she realized with a jolt of recognition that it was a woman. A woman who looked exactly like her. Who? Lu began, but her voice faltered. The woman smiled, her expression calm and knowing. It's time, Yifei, she said in a voice that was both soothing and unsettling at the same time. You've been chosen. Before Lu could respond, the woman raised a hand, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room. The air hummed with electricity, and Lu's vision blurred as a surge of energy hit her. She gasped, dropping her phone, feeling her body tingle as though every cell was waking up at once. The blue light around the woman grew stronger, pulling Lu forward, and suddenly, she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was somewhere else. Lu blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what was happening. The world around her shifted, colors blending, textures folding in and out of existence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. She found herself standing on a street corner. A completely different one. But it felt so familiar. A light breeze stirred the air, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted by. Lu breathed in deeply, trying to regain her bearings. She turned her head, expecting to see the usual city skyline of Beijing. But instead, she saw a different skyline entirely. The buildings were taller, sleeker, the architecture foreign yet recognizable, as if she had walked into a parallel version of her own world. What is this?" she murmured, staring at the streets around her. "This," the woman's voice answered from behind her, "is the beginning." Lu spun around. The woman stood there, as calm as ever, her blue glow still flickering gently. "This is a parallel world," Lu whispered, the weight of her words sinking in. She had heard rumors, stories in science fiction books and movies. But this? This was real, not just any parallel world, the woman replied, her tone soft, yet firm. "This is one of countless others." "And you," she said, pointing a finger at Lu, "you are connected to all of them." Lu shook her head, too overwhelmed to understand. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice strained. "You have the power to pull energy from any of these worlds. All you have to do is reach out," the woman explained, "and take it." With a flick of her wrist, the woman summoned a swirling orb of blue energy. It hovered just above her hand, crackling with power. Lu could feel the pull of it, something deep inside her urging her to reach out. But she hesitated. "This energy, it's not just power. It's life," the woman said, sensing Lu's unease. "The energy you pull is the life force of these worlds." Lu's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, the people here?" "Yes," the woman confirmed, her voice cold. "Every time you take from a world, you drain a little bit of its life force. And in time, those worlds will wither." "But," she paused, letting the silence settle between them. "You can save your world. You can save yourself." Lu's mind raced. She had so many questions, but the most pressing one was, why her? "Because," the woman answered before Lu could ask, "you were chosen. You are the only one capable of this. The only one who can tap into the energy of the multiverse." Lu's thoughts began to spiral, but she couldn't hold on to them for long. The feeling of the energy, the power at her fingertips, was too intoxicating. She could sense the potential of it, the untapped possibilities that lay before her. She could heal, she could change things, make her world a better place. All she had to do was take it, but at what cost? As if reading her mind, the woman's face darkened. "Every choice has consequences, Ife. If you continue to pull from these worlds, you'll save yours. But there's," she let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with implication. Lu could feel her pulse quicken. What was she supposed to do? Could she really let the other worlds collapse, just to save herself and the people she loved? The woman's expression softened. "Take your time. The power is yours now. You must choose how to use it." With that, she disappeared into the air, leaving Lu standing alone in the middle of the bustling street. Lu stood frozen, her mind spinning, unsure whether what had just happened was real or some bizarre hallucination brought on by the alcohol and lack of sleep. But the feeling, the surge of power still thrumming in her veins, was real. She reached up to touch her face, as if to make sure she was still grounded in her own body, but the sensation felt strange, almost foreign, as though she were an observer watching herself from the outside. She didn't know how long she stood there, her hand hanging in the air, until a subtle movement caught her eye. A man, probably in his early 40s, approached her on the street. His face looked weathered, but there was something familiar about him, something in the way he moved, the way he seemed to be walking toward her with a purpose. The energy around her flared just slightly, and for a brief moment, Lu could feel something stirring in her chest, almost like an echo of the man's own life force, his presence pulsing faintly in her mind. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tentative, as though unsure of how to begin. Are you all right? You look lost." Lu blinked, snapping out of her daze. She glanced up at the man, trying to focus. His clothes were different from what she was used to, though not by much, just a slight variation in color and fit. But his face, she didn't know why, but she felt like she should know him. "Yeah. I'm fine," she replied, a bit too quickly, but the words came out with an odd calmness. Just a little confused." The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with concern. "You're not from around here, are you? I can tell. I've never seen you before." Lu hesitated. She opened her mouth to say something, anything to explain herself, but no words came. Instead, a thought flickered through her mind. She needed to get away. Before she could stop herself, the energy surged inside her again, pulling her in all directions. Her hand shot out instinctively, and the world around her seemed to bend and twist. A low hum vibrated in the air, as though she were tuning into some distant radio station. The familiar street, no, the strange street, began to fade, the buildings distorting and then, reforming into something different. In an instant, she was standing in a completely different place. The man was gone. The city, if you could even call it that, looked even more alien. Towering structures stretched impossibly high, their surfaces rippling with iridescent colors, their design unlike anything she had ever seen. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the sound of a low hum filled her ears, like a machine vibrating just below the threshold of hearing. Lu's heart was racing. Her hand shook as she took a step forward, her eyes scanning her surroundings in disbelief. She wasn't sure how she had just done that, but it felt as though she had shifted. Changed reality. Just like the woman had said, she could feel the energy pulsing around her, waiting for her to reach out, to pull it in. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to retreat, to run back to the familiar world she knew. But something else, something deeper, urged her to stay. To experiment. To see what this power could really do. She stood there for a long moment, watching as strange, translucent vehicles floated by, their occupants gliding silently through the air. This was another world, another dimension. And it was hers for the taking. Lu didn't know how long she stood there, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Every instinct told her to move, to do something. But for now, she couldn't bring herself to take that first step. She knew the risks. She understood, at least on some level, the power she wielded. But at the same time, there was something almost hypnotic about it. Like a siren song, calling her to dive deeper, the hum in the air shifted, becoming a low, vibrating thrum. The strange energy around her responded, crackling through her fingers. She reached out tentatively, her hand brushing the air. For a brief second, nothing happened, but then she felt it, a surge of warmth, almost like a shock of static electricity. The world shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just the scenery. She felt something change inside her, something that wasn't just physical. It was as though she had just absorbed the very essence of the world she was standing in, its history, its life force. Lu gasped, pulling her hand back instinctively, but she could still feel the ripples of that energy coursing through her. The sensation was overwhelming, like being plugged into an electric socket. But beneath it all, there was something darker. Something wrong. Her breath quickened. She could feel it now, the gradual draining of life from the world she had just touched. The air around her grew cold, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the shadows of the buildings flicker, as if they were decaying before her eyes. What had she done? Lu's heart pounded in her chest, panic flooding through her. She looked around, and the street seemed quieter now. The hum was still there, but it was fading, becoming weaker. As though the very life of this world were slowly being siphoned away. No, she whispered, taking a step back. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She hadn't meant to. A sharp, pained cry broke her from her thoughts. Lu whipped around, her eyes scanning the street. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She felt a deep pang of guilt knot in her stomach. The woman had warned her, hadn't she? The life force of these worlds, it wasn't just energy. It was the lives of people, the very core of their existence. Lu closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. The world seemed to ripple around her, as though it was about to tear apart. She could feel the consequences of her actions, felt them in her bones. The energy she had absorbed was no longer just a thrill or a gift. It was a weight she couldn't escape. She let out a shuddering breath. This wasn't just about her anymore. She wasn't the only one living in these worlds. There were real people here, real lives. And she had just taken something from them. Something vital. The air around her seemed to tremble with the weight of her realization. She couldn't stop herself from reaching out for more energy, but now she could feel the cost. Every world she drew from, every life she took from, it was costing someone, somewhere, everything. Lou staggered backward, trying to shake off the feeling that was settling deep in her gut. She had to stop. She had to pull back, but how? She didn't know. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop. Not really. The power, the sense of control, it was intoxicating, but she knew this wasn't sustainable, not if she wanted to live with herself. Before she could take another step, the world around her seemed to shimmer again, this time fading back to the city she knew. The change was sudden, disorienting, and she was back on the street where she had started. The man was gone, and the world around her felt quieter, as though it had been muted, and then, without warning, the blue energy crackled through her again. Lou felt the hum build inside her, and she knew it was calling her back. The blue energy surged again, stronger this time, as though the very air around her had come alive. Lou felt a pulse of power surge through her chest, rattling her bones, making the hairs on her arms stand at attention. It was no longer just a feeling of being connected to the energy, it was a pull, a magnetic force that had her in its grip. Her mind raced, her instincts screamed for her to resist, to stop. But the temptation was overwhelming. She could feel the weight of it, the power that could change everything, the lives of her loved ones, her future, her survival. With each passing second, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Lou stumbled back, her mind reeling as she tried to regain control. She couldn't let this consume her. She couldn't let herself become another person who used power without thinking, without understanding the consequences. But every part of her, the part that had been quietly dissatisfied with her life, the part that wanted more, that wanted to escape, was whispering to her to take it. To seize it. To become something more than just herself. But she remembered the pain she had felt in the other worlds. The flickering decay of life that followed her every action. Every time she took, something in those worlds was dying. Was it worth it? Was the protection of her own world worth the destruction of so many others? Her heart raced. What if she could find a way to balance it? What if she could use the energy without completely draining the worlds around her? Was it possible to do just enough to survive, just enough to heal the ones she loved, and not bring ruin to the multiverse? As the blue energy wrapped around her, forming a tight cocoon, Lou's thoughts became a blur. She closed her eyes, trying to push the overwhelming sensation of it all away. The voices in her head, her doubts, her desires, her fear, clashed together, all demanding attention. In that moment, a new voice broke through, softer than the others, a whisper in the back of her mind. It was the woman who had first introduced her to this power. "You are at a crossroads," she said, her voice both familiar and distant. "You are not the only one who has felt the pull of this energy. But you are the only one who can choose what happens next." Lou's pulse thudded in her ears, her body quivering with the weight of that truth. She opened her eyes again, and for a moment, she saw not the city streets around her, but a field of stars, each one a different reality, a different life. They twinkled brightly, but each one had a shadow flickering at its edges. She saw flashes of the people in those worlds, their faces, their moments, each of them tethered to her in some way, each one flickering like a candle in the wind, about to be extinguished by her actions. "You must choose," the woman's voice echoed. "What will you do with this power? How many will you save, and how many will you sacrifice?" Lou clenched her fists, feeling the energy crackling through her fingertips. She could feel it coursing through her body, every cell vibrating with the potential of it. But beneath the pulse, there was a warning, subtle, but undeniable. She wasn't just taking energy. She was taking life. She could feel the death in it, the hollow emptiness of the worlds that were slowly dying, fading away, and yet, the pull of survival, of personal gain, was still so strong. What if she could just take a little more? Just enough to fix things in her world, to protect it, to heal it, and then stop before it was too late? No, the word came to her with a clarity that cut through everything else. She knew what she had to do. The choice wasn't about how much she could take. It was about how much she was willing to sacrifice. Lu took a deep breath, her mind finally clearing. She could feel the energy building around her, but this time, she didn't reach for it. She didn't pull it in. Instead, she let it wash over her, like a wave, without absorbing it. It felt like a test of endurance, like holding back the tide of a storm. No more. The words fell from her lips before she could stop them, a declaration that shook her to the core. The energy around her seemed to hesitate, as though confused by her resistance. But Lu stood firm. She could feel the worlds connected to her, each one still whispering, still reaching out, but she could no longer take from them. Not without costing them something too precious. For what felt like an eternity, she stood there, caught between two worlds, the one she was trying to protect and the one she had been draining. Slowly, she began to withdraw, not just from the energy around her, but from the compulsion to take more, to feed off the life force of countless other realities. With a final, almost imperceptible shift, the world around her seemed to settle. The energy dissipated, no longer crackling through the air. The pressure in her chest lifted, and for the first time in what felt like days, Lu took a deep, steadying breath. She was still standing in the middle of the city, but it no longer felt like the world was spinning out of control. The buildings around her seemed to stabilize, the hum of the streets calming into a gentle rhythm, but the stillness was short-lived. As Lu took another step, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a faint vibration beneath her feet. She looked around, her senses on high alert. It was almost as if the city itself was holding its breath, and then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared before her, a tall, shadowy figure who seemed to flicker in and out of focus. For a moment, Lu wasn't sure if it was real or just a product of her mind's exhaustion, but the figure stepped forward, solidifying with each passing second. "You made your choice," the voice said, low and commanding. It wasn't the woman who had guided her, nor was it any of the others she had encountered. This voice felt ancient, heavy with the weight of countless worlds. Lu's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The figure tilted its head, as though studying her. "I am the balance." The voice reverberated through the very air around her. "I am what ensures that all things, all lives, remain in equilibrium. And you, Louis, are the one who has disturbed that balance." Her stomach twisted with unease. I was trying to fix things. To save my world. I thought it was the right choice." The figure's expression softened, just a fraction. "You cannot save your world by sacrificing others. You cannot take from one and not expect the ripples to reach across all. The balance must be restored." Before Lu could respond, the air around them seemed to darken, swirling like a storm, and she felt herself being pulled forward. The world around her shifted again, but this time it wasn't to another version of her world. This time, it was somewhere else. A world in ruins. The sky was blood red, and the air was thick with ash. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and lifeless, the remains of buildings half sunk into the earth. In the distance, a faint silhouette moved, someone, or something, walking through the devastation. Lu stepped forward, her heart heavy with dread, and then, she saw it, herself. A version of herself, but this one was different. She was older, her face drawn with exhaustion, her body hunched beneath the weight of what looked like a great burden. "Is this what happens?" Lu whispered, her voice trembling. "Is this what I'm doing to them? To all the worlds?" The other version of her turned, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met, and in that look, Lu understood. "It's already happening," the other version of her said, her voice barely audible. The balance is slipping. And when it's gone, so are we. The world around them seemed to tremble, as though it, too, was on the brink of collapsing. Lou stepped back, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. She could feel the energy around her again, buzzing in her veins, urging her to act. But this time, there was no exhilaration in it. No pull to take more. There was only the deep, gnawing sense of responsibility. She could no longer pretend that what she was doing didn't matter. She had already made a choice once, but this time, she had to make the right one. Taking a deep breath, Lou let the energy wash over her once more, not as something to absorb, but as something to release, and slowly, ever so slowly, she began to let it go.